Madam Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen, I have received a very detailed set of instructions from the Auditor, which I intend to follow to the letter. They read, once the Auditor will call on you to take the chair, you should move to the table, I'm already here, and say, I call this House to order. So, I call this House to order. I would like now to call on the Record Secretary to read the minutes of the last public business meeting of the Society.
Woo!
Eco-Terrorism. And if I'm being honest, I don't want to joke about eco-terrorism in front of a camera and a crowd full of people. Just joke about terrorism, Jane. It'll be fine, Jane. Eco-terrorism is the most palatable form of terrorism. That's what people told me.
Point.
No. But you see, I have been confronted with a similar problem. I have been here before. The day was September 11th, 2011. They asked me to speak in the chamber debate, this house would eat the rich. And the opportunity was looking me right in the eye. You see, I come from a long line of New York City white trash. I am from a little beach town in Queens where the only job prospects are racist cop, racist firefighter, or racist garbage man. 9/11 was kind of our day. So I played my 9/11 card and took that opportunity to make just a few jokes about terrorism. Watch out, little boys. And as you may imagine, this ended poorly for me. And after an attempted cancellation by the University Times, I learned my lesson. Never joke about terrorism. It will always crash and burn. So there being no further business at the last public business meeting, ever. Thank you.
I have my doubts that that is a true and fair account of the last meeting of the Society, but I must ask, are there any objections to my signing these minutes as a true and accurate account of the last meeting? And there being no objections, I shall duly sign. And my instruction sheet says at this point, sign. Let the record note I have signed. I should now like to call on the Auditor to introduce the standing orders for this evening.
That's me. So, standing orders will be that speeches are 7 minutes in length, unless you are a guest, like author John Gibbons or climate activist Jessica Dunn. Guest speeches can be up to 10 minutes. At the first and last minute of your speech, you're going to hear this bell. So in between those bells, we encourage other speakers as well as the audience to give POIs. POI is just another way of saying question or point of information. And we would encourage speakers during their speeches to take those points of information or questions, but they don't have to. You can just write them down. Now, in general, audience participation is encouraged. That could look like call-outs, like shouting "here, here" if you agree with something, or "shame" if you don't agree with something. But you hear that one else. We will not be doing floor speeches this evening, so if you want to have your opinion heard, we recommend you do it through a POI or a question to your fellow speakers or from the audience. You'll hear the bell twice when your time is up, and 3 times when your time is very much up at 7 minutes and 15 seconds, or 10 minutes and 15 seconds. So, that's it from me. Good luck to all our speakers. It's going to be a really good debate.
Thank you, Madam Auditor. The motion before the House this evening is that this House supports eco-terrorism, and it gives me great pleasure to call on the first speaker to propose the motion, Lachlan.
Ladies and gentlemen, when our beloved correspondence secretary, Ben Kenninglieren, sent me the request to speak at this debate, I was filled with a deep sense of gratitude, but also of a looming dread. I asked myself, as an art student, what do I truly know about the climate crisis? How can I add to this debate in a meaningful way? And that led me down some research. I looked through the foremost eco-terrorist thinkers of our time, the Earth Liberation Front, the Earth First Party. And I came to a very interesting and pivotal figure whose work has been around for decades at this point, and it's a quote that inspired me greatly. I'm the Lorax. I speak for the trees. If you litter again, I will break your knees. Anyway, jokes aside, I believe that we need to adopt eco-terrorism as the not the one and only method of climate activism, obviously, but we need to support it wholeheartedly in order to enact real change in regards to the climate crisis. And why is this? This is because climate change recently has become a nearly irrelevant issue to most people. Climate change is never the most pressing concern in the countries that are most responsible for it. For example, in Ireland, we can all see the effects of the climate crisis as it's progressed in the past few years. But for us, that looks like the temperature dropping a few degrees or raising a few degrees in summer. We say, wow, I need to buy a new coat. I should put on another layer. I need to drink more water during the summertime. Meanwhile, in impoverished countries, this looks like natural disasters completely wiping out their infrastructure. But these countries can do little to actually stop their emissions, and they're always smaller emitters anyway. The big countries are causing all the problems. Anyway, climate activism has fallen off a cliff for a variety of reasons. Like I said, it's never the most important issue in countries that are the most responsible for this, and this is due for a variety of reasons. But I would like to credit most foremost the rise of the performative climate activist. These people come in many different shapes and forms. In the day-to-day life, this is your mate who proclaims their love of the bottle deposit return scheme, gladly collecting all of their plastic bottles and recycling them with pride, and before promptly opening up ChatGPT to write their essay that they haven't spent any time on the past 3 weeks while going to the PAV. This looks like your favorite musicians who love to parade around climate activism in between their daily scheduled trips in their private jets. This looks like your politicians who throw in some climate activism into their manifesto to get the youth vote, the green vote, all while spending their entire term betting on dog racing and defending the marginalized people in our community. By that, I of course mean landowners. On top of this, recent climate activism, or at least the climate activism that gets the most attention from the media, is, quite frankly, absurdist, masochistic humiliation rituals, like throwing soup on paintings, not paint on soup. I don't know what that would be. Going into the Wimbledon tennis competition, or just simply blocking the road. To most people, this just looks annoying and bothersome, and it doesn't communicate any real issues about the climate crisis. It merely says, these people think it's an issue and they're annoying us. So subconsciously, we're going to associate that feeling. Yep?
So when you, go up a boss to do eco-terrorism, people aren't going to think you're...
Yes, actually, I'm going to get to that. Listen, we can all agree that the climate crisis is a big issue and the reputation of climate activists is in the gutter. And this isn't because climate activists are doing the wrong things per se. It's because the deck is stacked against them. Climate activists do important work every day, but because of the nature of the media machine, which is in large part funded by organizations who have a vested interest in perpetuating the climate crisis, none of their most important work gets publicized. Instead, we get this, like I said, humiliation, masochistic-esque rituals. So, as a result of this, we've seen a massive drop-off. The Green parties across Europe have massively failed. In Ireland, the Green Party has 1 seat in the Dáil. Their power is roughly equivalent to 1 member of Freedom Ireland. And as a result, we're slowing to a grinding halt. The Paris Accords have not had any of their targets met, and countries like the US, the biggest emitter of fossil fuels in the entire world, regularly pull out and with their, as they feel. Our methods aren't working. Our protests are not working. Playing fair is not working. We cannot let the climate crisis gestate like this while we sit by and do nothing. We need a radical change. If people aren't going to treat this like a major problem, we need to give them a major problem to worry about. All right? Eco-terrorism is the only way we can effect a significant change and reignite the cause. First off, just a preface, I'm sure opposition may not go here, but I think we can all agree that most eco-terrorism will take the form of property damage. This has been the historical precedent, and most people adopt it because people, have moral preferences, and they would rather blow up a pipeline than kill someone. I mean, I don't know the opinions of the crowd here. Could I get a here for murder? Woo! Enough said. So, why will eco-terrorism work where peaceful activism has not? It showcases the urgency of the situation. Like I said, while with normal climate activism, the kind that gets published associates it with annoyingness, now we associate the issue with violence, with urgency, with destruction. And even though that might lead to some people having a bad opinion of us, first off, the opinion of the climate activists is already very bad for the reasons I've outlined, so we can't really make this reputation much worse. But also, yeah. Yeah, but like I said, they're not going to kill you for the reason that I've outlined. I didn't see a here for murder, like I said. So, like I said, it showcases urgency, and it also goes after the real offenders, which are the companies, the big oil conglomerates. The reason why a lot of people distance themselves from the climate activists now is because they feel like they're getting blamed for an issue that isn't their fault. There's only so much the average person can do about climate change, and yet they get lambasted by ordinary people like them. It's causing an internal division. Really, we should be going after the biggest culprits. So we should be going after the corporations. We should become an issue that cannot be ignored by the government by actively harming their bottom line. So the way that we achieve this goal, we bring more energy into the movement by showcasing our commitment. We're not just risking embarrassment. We're risking arrest. We're risking our reputations. We're risking all these things. We're risking our own safety in order to show what we believe in. That's going to galvanize people towards us. We're making the government look bad because we're showing our moral high ground. We're emphasizing the fact that they aren't doing what they should and they're ruining our future, which puts them at the risk of not getting reelected. And we're harming these companies by damaging their bottom line. So, for all these reasons, I would beg you to propose this case.
Thank you, Lachlan, for an excellent speech, and it now gives me great pleasure to call on the first speaker for the opposition, Sandy.
Okay. I feel like I'm going to repeat a lot of what Prop said, but two things that they have said that I will hopefully contradict in my essay. Eco-terrorism requires public buy-in, which I don't really see why that happens on their case. And number two, not really a point that I'm going to make, but something that should be noted, eco-terrorism is not a moral high ground. I don't really know why it is. Okay, so what does eco-terrorism look like? Eco-terrorism is committed to furthering the interests of the environment, climate, and all of that cool, snazzy stuff that we're going to talk about. What terrorism specifically entails doesn't actually matter to me, but the intentions of terrorism do. And in this case, it's to coerce the government or big companies or any other body to act in a certain way to change their current course of action. So I don't think this debate is about whether the environment matters, but whether eco-terrorism is the way to advance its interests. So I would say eco-terrorists achieve their aims in two broad ways. Number one, they use publicity as a platform for awareness to create social change. And number two, they attempt to cripple an industry or firm by attacking its capacity to operate, aka where it makes money. So addressing the first point, I would say using publicity to raise awareness leads to apathy and disenfranchisement with the environmental movement. So creating publicity is often performative, like Lachlan said, property damage, vandalism, arson, etc. So take Just Stop Oil, for example. They can be classified as terrorist organization, up to you, doesn't really matter. But the fact is that their acts of protest, such as throwing soup at paintings, I did get that right, blocking roads and spraying Stonehenge with weird orange powder, are all done to get media attention. But more often than not, they're a public nuisance. So when soup is thrown, paintings can't be viewed, galleries need to be cleaned up, it's pushed onto like the cleaner to clean it up. No, thank you. When roads are blocked, the guards need to be called, people are late to work, etc. So people don't necessarily care about egalitarian motives. Why? Because they have more immediate issues that are more important to them, like paying rent, studying for exams, figuring out interpersonal relationships, because this generation is great at having, like, known for their people skills, whatever. So yes, climate change is real, it is a problem, but people don't necessarily care about it because they have more pressing issues. So repeated disturbances are just annoying. So throwing soup once, spectacle. Doing it multiple times, it just loses its effectiveness. And it doesn't really matter what the spectacle is and if it changes, as long as people are being inconvenienced, they'll grow apathetic, which means eco-terrorism is just ineffective as a method for creating change. The goal is to create awareness through, no, thank you. The goal is to create awareness through publicity, and hopefully it gathers enough public attention that something is done. But more often than not, it doesn't actually change policy, it just gets attention. But that doesn't really do anything because big firms or the governments don't really care because they have individuals with bigger interests who have more funding, more political power, and more resources. Big firms don't really answer to the public, and when they're that big, bad media attention rarely does anything to harm them. So all we can get from acts of protest is public nuisance, which leads to apathy, as the public sees these groups as something that disturbs their life. Because the burdens of action, like Lachlan said, have been pushed to ordinary people who, for the most part, care very little about the overall state of the environment. This pushes people away from the environmental aspect because when they advocate for the climate, they're associated with radical action and people have a negative perception about it. So even if it works once and policy is changed, its repeated use is not effective and it distances people from the climate movement. So whatever, no thank you, I can't take POIs today, I'm sorry. Whatever statements these environmental groups are trying to make falls on deaf ears. The public doesn't care about the long-term capacity of the world, hence it's not a priority for them to devote resources or attention to solving this issue. So like Lachlan said, if that's the case, why don't we shift, is the solution to turn away from inconveniencing the public to inconveniencing the perpetrator? For example, this could look like spiking logs, drowning whaling boats, and damaging factories. Well, I think the issue with this is that more people are likely to get hurt. Even if it's not your intention, people are going to get hurt regardless because drastic action takes drastic measures, and in this case, it's ordinary people that get hurt. People who most likely don't even want to be there because I don't think it's anyone's life dream to be chopping logs. Unless you're really cool or something, I don't know. So spiking logs hurts people, and it's not necessarily the company that's being hurt because workers are replaceable. The company could pay a bit of compensation and brush everything under the rug. For example, drowning whaling boats harms people, and it certainly costs maybe some money to the company, but it's not sustainable in the long run because for eco-terrorism to work, you need a set of resources. People aren't made of money, especially in the capitalist world where we're all poor and stuff. We don't have the money to okay. So it's not sustainable. Companies have more resources than eco-terrorists do, and they have greater incentive and capacity to continue what they're doing. They can move to a new location, they can hire more security. So in the long run, the big firms are still fine. They can still recover from attacks, but ordinary people can't. So eco-terrorism just can't win war with $1 million industry. And the thing about hurting people is that it's a great way to shift the attention from the damage big firms are causing to environmental groups, which are now living up to the name of terrorists. The moment violence occurs, the narrative shifts and it becomes about activists and not the environment, which causes more harm to the environmental movement as a whole because now people associated with activism or climate change have a bad reputation. They're considered dangerous, and they don't want to be associated with things, especially if you want a job, which in this economy is really hard. So if the point is to create change, pushing the public away from your side is not the best way to do it. So proposition may sway you with beautiful ideas of radical change and opposing the bourgeoisie, but what they won't tell you is that most people are quite happy with not being a part of radical change. Most people won't be willing to contribute, especially because here where we live in Ireland, like Lachlan said, climate change isn't very real. There's no droughts, there's no floods, you're not starving, most likely. And if it's not real, surely it can't matter more than the 2 essays I need to write, because if I can't sort out my life first, there's no way I care about figuring out a problem that are yet to be actualized to me. If climate change feels distant and activism is annoying, you get indifference from the public. The people actually suffering from climate change, they have other issues, like trying to sort out their life, maybe not trying to starve to death, so they probably don't really care, or they don't really matter in this debate in terms of supporting eco-terrorism or doing anything to actually or committing terrorism, I guess. So the underlying issue is that the people with the capacity to create change don't care about the environment, and hence it's difficult to get mass movement or public support, which is necessary especially for radical action. You need public buy-in. Hence, eco-terrorism creates even more apathy to the environmental cause, and it disenfranchises people from it. So it's not an effective long-term policy, even if in the short run it yields marginal benefits. So I don't see how Prop can win this argument unless they show us why people want to join eco-terrorism stuff.
Thank you very much, and it now gives me great pleasure to call on our first guest speaker for the evening to propose the motion, Jessica Dunn.
I rode this debate in the car on the way to see my friends. 3 23-year-old students. They had been held in Limerick prison for 2 days. Their crime was opposing genocide, spray painting a US military plane, bringing weaponry to Israel. Their equivalent in the UK are officially labelled terrorists. In Ireland, it's still unofficial, but the characterization stands. The military pull weaponry on them, they are held in state prisons for days, they are repressed and villainized, while the Irish government allows the US military to transport the instruments of genocide through our airspace. In the face of such hypocrisy, it makes one question what the term terrorism achieves. Terrorism is a term that allows us to condemn the so-called violence of civilians and non-governmental groups while quietly legitimizing state violence. Therefore, 3 23-year-olds spray painting a US warplane is treated as violence, and the genocide committed by Israel is not. The Palestine Solidarity Movement has largely embraced direct action as a means of protest in their advocacy, leading them to be categorized as terrorists in the UK. In contrast, the climate movement that grew out of the 2018 Fridays for Future frenzy prides itself in peaceful, non-violent protest. The climate movement achieved cultural victory after cultural victory during this peak period starting in 2018. We saw tens of thousands of people marching on the streets, a surge of votes for green politicians. It became normal to talk about the climate crisis. In the movement, we were easily platformed by mainstream media, invited to meetings with high-ranking ministers, and invited as keynote speakers to sustainability events in Ireland and abroad. We thought that these were signs that this was a turning point where we would see real action from the government. We consciously decided to keep our images as clean as possible, staying palatable and stressing the peaceful nature of our protests. We didn't realize that the mainstream welcoming us with open arms was a warning sign. We had unwittingly become the perfect instruments by which the state and media could perform concern for the planet through heartwarming meetings with the youth. Meanwhile, those experiencing the impacts of the climate crisis today were still going unheard. We watered down our message to get a seat at the table, and once we were there, we realized that while afraid of losing that seat, we could not advocate for the causes that prompted us to perform palatability in the first place. In the process, we had pushed away more radical voices. Now, with the liberal activists taking their place, why would those in power choose to listen to the hard truths of those who do not eat their words? When the public lost interest in the climate and the frenzy died, we realized how worthless all of the cultural victories had been. Little had materially changed about our government's approach to climate action. I'm not going to deny the victories that we had. Our carbon emissions are the lowest that they have been since the 1990s, and that is significant owing to regulations within agriculture. However, we are still not anywhere near our projected reduction goals, and without serious structural commitments to public transport and renewable energy infrastructures, we won't even get close. This is not to mention the amount of emissions caused by data centers, which use up large quantities of water and electricity to store data for large companies, by which they track our online habits for profit. These data centers also store and process the information used in AI models, which are famously energy intensive. While we have been pushing for incremental change and waiting for the government to act with the urgency this crisis requires, they are authorizing that more and more of these centers are built, destroying our planet with every piece of data stored and prompt generated. There is a compulsion still within the climate movement to gently push our governments in the right direction, commending them for their efforts thus far, giving them more credit than their due, and encouraging them to push forward. It is a compulsion which has left the climate movement in Ireland defanged and toothless. There is a strange cognitive dissonance when it comes to the climate crisis, which the first speaker on this side really kind of put into perspective. A slow creeping destruction is brewing, stemming from capitalism and upheld by our governments. Every year, it claims more lives. It is slow moving, so we put it to the back of our minds, but it will come for us all. Protest has always been backed up with the threat of action, and when talks fail, why do we not turn to action? When Ireland fought for her independence, she took up arms and became ungovernable. When land defenders saw those who thought to destroy the land, they responded with force. When actionists saw Israeli weaponry passing through Irish airspace, they drove a van through the airport fence and damaged the planes in whatever way they could. The climate movement must learn to take action, to not simply ask for, but demand climate justice. It will always be the state's prerogative to villainize those who realize the power of action. We must resist their attempts at slander, at repression. Terrorism is a denotation which allows the state to retain the monopoly on violence. Yes?
I'm trying to be charitable here, but is your plan to blow up data centers and then go to jail, and then they build the data centers once you're in jail, or is there any other plan you want to put forward that's like vague rhetoric?
There is there's such a thing as like a pronged strategy. So you can have people pushing for legislation, but as well as that, in the same way that like when we look at like again the push for Irish independence, a lot of it is about becoming ungovernable. With this, you have to make it more profitable for them to reduce their data centers. You have to make it actually the phrase that Enda Galanda use as their slogan is "We are the investment risk." Enda Galanda are a direct action group for climate, and they go in and destroy and attack coal mines and different fossil fuel plants. And it is by being the investment risk and by making it less profitable with every time we do action that we are able to actually make change, as well as pushing in the more legislative sense. Terrorism is a denotation which allows the state to retain the monopoly on violence. While they retain this monopoly, the power of protest is only skin deep. They implicitly consent to the protests which happen without violent state intervention. We must fight in spite of their monopoly. We must push for radical and tangible action that targets the perpetrating forces of the climate crisis. It is my firm belief that this House should stand in support of eco-terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And now I call on our second guest speaker for the night to oppose the motion, John Gibbons.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this debate. I took part in a very similar debate in this room on a very similar topic of eco-terrorism 6 years ago. This is back before COVID. And again, at the time, there was a lot of shall we say, agonizing about what's the best way for the climate movement to go forward. And this, of course, predates, by the way, this predates the successes of Greta Thunberg, the climate movement of 2018 and 2019, the millions of people mobilized, the tens of thousands of people on the streets in Dublin. So it predates that. So at that time, I think the general consensus was, let's play within the rules. Let's keep it clean for the very reasons that some of the earlier speakers have alluded to, because we want to stay in the room, we want to stay mainstream. Now, the problem, of course, is that we're in the throes of rampant ecological terrorism right now. I'm giving it its full title, ecological terrorism, because when you hear the phrase eco-terrorism, you conflate it a bit like Antifa. Ooh, who's Antifa? No, they're anti-fascist, right? In the same way, ecological terrorism is happening right now all over the world. It has been perpetrated by corporations, backed by governments. There's extreme violence being delivered against ordinary members of the public throughout the world. We see it among the direct violence, for example, doled out to environmental defenders, hundreds of whom are killed every year, thousands driven off their land. So this is, by any definition, ecological terrorism. Deforestation of native forests, that is a form of terrorism. You're destroying, that is ecocide, that is the deliberate destruction, as it happens for profit, of entire ecosystems and the pressing into extinction of species unique to this world. So we already have a situation where we're knee-deep in ecological terrorism, right? Now, it's often been said that who are the terrorists? They're the ones with the small guns, right? That it's about I think Jessica alluded to this earlier. It's who controls the narrative, who gets to call who names, right? So, for example, the UN Special Rapporteur, Mary Lawler, she issued a report last month to the UN General Assembly, and she reported about attacks on citizens defending human rights related to climate change. She said they're surging. And this isn't just in the far distant corners of the world. She said it's happening right inside the European Union. She said non-violent protesters worldwide have been charged with crimes such as unlawful assembly, common nuisance, qualified disobedience, financing terrorism, and my favourite, promoting enmity. Oh dear, making people feel bad, right? Maybe they've been charged with the crime of hurting somebody's feelings. I mean, seriously. So what we are seeing right across the world, and again, this is happening in Germany, it's happening in Britain, it's happening in France, it's happening in Spain. These are sort of mainstream European democracies that are weaponizing state violence against peaceful climate protesters. Extreme state violence. There's a particular case of a young woman in England who received a 5-year jail sentence. And you want to know her crime? She organised a Zoom call at which they were going to discuss the possibility of blocking, you know, these embankments over motorways. They were going to drop down some posters. And you know what? It may have caused traffic disruption for a while. That is a possibility. And for her pains, she went to jail. And on her release, and others released from jail, some of them are now coming out on licence, they're wearing ankle bracelets, and they're forbidden from using the internet or from meeting any other climate activists. This is a form of extreme state violence. Now, back in those 6 years ago that I was describing when I was in this room, I couldn't have described any of those attacks against peaceful climate action to you. Do you know why? Because they weren't happening. What has happened in the meanwhile is, what's gone mainstream is climate breakdown. And what the state's response to climate breakdown, in a logical, rational world, the state would respond to climate breakdown by strong climate action. But guess what? That involves stepping on a lot of very powerful toes. So we won't be having that. So what we're going to do instead is, we're going to squelch the alarm. What is climate action? What is climate activism? It is sounding the alarm in an emergency. If this room was filling up with smoke and I was standing up here screaming, "Get up, get out of here," would you say, "Stop being so alarmist, John? I mean, it's just a bit of smoke," right? No, you wouldn't. You'd say, actually, time to go. This is what climate activists are doing worldwide. They're ringing the alarm. And for their troubles, they are being criminalized, marginalized, brutalized. And we're seeing, of course, a close confluence between climate activism and peace and justice activism. So we now see, for example, the Palestine protest movement thrown in exactly the same bear pit as climate protesters, for exactly the same thing, for standing up for basic human rights is now a criminal offence. This is something that the state has decided is a step too far for citizens. So, as I said in my opening remarks, the great violence in the world is the violence of the powerful against the weak, the violence of man against nature, and indeed man against his fellow man. That is the extreme accelerating violence. Now, this violence is taking us to an incredibly dark place. We know with a tremendous amount of confidence that the pathway, the climatic pathway that we're on right now, and we've just exited COP30, so we've had 30 years of talking shops to turn this around. It's not working. For example, in those 30 years, the phrase "phase out fossil fuels" has appeared once in COP28 and disappeared again this year. We can't even talk about it. It's like going to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, but we can't talk about giving up booze. In fact, it's like bringing a bottle of booze to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. So these COP processes, and again, for context, the Intergovernmental Panel process, which is the countries of the world getting together to solve climate change, this kicked off in the early to mid-90s. Now, if we tot all the carbon emissions up to 1990, like I'm talking about for the previous 500 years. And then we taught the carbon emissions from 1990 to the present day. We've released more carbon into the global atmosphere since 1990, since we started getting on top of this crisis, than in all the 200 or 500 years before 1990. So, this is a form of extreme violence, as I say, visited by the powerful upon the weak. It's also, of course, a form of carbon colonialism, because if you think of it this way, we have a finite global atmosphere that can only absorb a certain amount of carbon emissions before the thing basically breaks down. That's how it works. Now, the latest estimate is that we will exceed, for the next 1,000 years, the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees by about 2028, possibly, if we're lucky, 2029. After that, it's gone for the next 1,000 years. Now, you might say, well, okay, John, we've turned it around. We've peaked and we're on the downturn. Well, sorry to break it to you, even allowing for the incredible uptake of renewables over the last 3 or 4 years, we burned more carbon in 2024 than in any year in human history prior to 2024. And we're seeing the manifestations of this carbon assault on our shared environment in an amping up of extreme, increasingly deadly weather events. And we're going to see these. It is an exponential process. This is not a linear process. There is this idea, and I've alluded to it in various places, that here in Ireland in particular, we live in a sort of a Goldilocks country. Not too hot, not too cold. And what we have in Ireland is a tremendous concern about climate change. It's a mile wide and an inch deep. Again, one of the speakers alluded to it earlier. We're far more exercised about the end of the month than the end of the world. Now, that's understandable because we've all got bills to pay, we've got essays to hand in, we've got, whatever it is that you do. We all have these things. However, we citizens expect our governments, our civil servants, the agencies of state to be up in the bird's nest, looking forward towards the icebergs, looking for threats to inform society. What are they doing? They're arresting people for pointing out the coming crisis. This has been the response. This has been the response of our societies, particularly right here in Europe, the criminalization, the demonization of climate action. And I'll finish with an anecdote, and this is a relative of mine who's a doctor in London, and she's feisty. She's an activist. She's a kick-ass. But she said to me recently in confidence, she said, I'm afraid to go out protesting against Palestine because if I'm arrested, which I will be, I'll lose my job, right? I'll throw 10 or 12 years down the Swanee, right? Imagine placing that on the heads of people who are simply trying to do their best. And an absolute conclusion, again, I'll stay with the UK for a second. What we now know is that the rate of arrests by the British police and prosecutions of peaceful climate activists is 3 times greater than of violent far-right activists. Now, what that tells you is the weaponization of the instruments of state. Why? How can peaceful, often elderly climate activists represent a greater threat to the state, requiring more suppression, more imprisonment, more brutality than far-right thugs who want to kill people? How are they such a threat? And the answer, of course, is they threaten the status quo, they threaten the money, and until we challenge that, we're whistling in the wind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for a speech in opposition to the motion, but in favour of eco-terrorism, I think. So we must move on to our next speaker for in favour of the motion, who is Athena.
It is good to be back up here. I haven't spoken in chamber in a while. And there's actually a reason for that, which is that the committee last year actually banned me from speaking in these for drawing too many analogies from my employment at McDonald's during serious debates. But I did quit my job eventually, so it's okay. And I also did promise to the current committee of 256 that I would never again make an overarching thematic analogy in my speech about an ironic activity that I'm participating in, especially in motions like this that deal with particularly sensitive topics. But on a completely unrelated note, I started playing Ultimate Frisbee this year. And one of the first thoughts I had when I joined the club was that there are actually an awful lot of similarities between Ultimate Frisbee and eco-terrorism. Well, first of all, the first similarity is that both phrases are made up of two parts, Ultimate Frisbee, eco-terrorism, so that's one thing. But also, there's a cultural perception that the first word makes the second word marginally more socially acceptable. So if you tell people you play Frisbee, most of the time they don't care. But if you say Ultimate Frisbee, I think that adds a little bit more respect onto your name, or at least people are more intrigued. If you tell people you're a terrorist, suddenly you're getting forcibly removed from the Hist committee room, and multiple people are renewing their restraining orders against you as well. So, but if you qualify by saying you're an eco-terrorist, there are some people that are more sympathetic. A third similarity then is that the in-game strategies of the Ultimate Frisbee player and the eco-terrorist have a little bit of overlap in many obvious ways, but I'll just highlight one. For example, the way that you score a point in Ultimate Frisbee is by catching the disc in the end zone, which is like the end of the pitch. Sometimes, though, the other team has really great defenders. So if you're facing a team that's freakishly tall or a team that runs exclusively on a diet of breast milk, like UCD, you will find it hard to pass the Frisbee to your teammate in the end zone. There's also an 8-second time limit on being in possession of the disc, so you can't really just be stationary. You have to make a choice, you have to do something. If the other team is blocking you from passing to your teammate in the end zone, though, you have to throw your disc to your reset teammate, who is the person behind you, even if that means the disc is further away from the area that you need it to be. But it's something that you have to do in the short term to protect yourself, I guess, from the other team gaining possession in the long term and winning the game. So that illustration, I think, will help you understand my stance on eco-terrorism. But I want to preface my actual argument by saying one very important point, which I think needs to be said at this point in the debate, that there is a range, a spectrum, basically, of environmental harms, from reducing the effects of climate change, to preventing the depletion of finite resources, to preserving biodiversity, etc. But for the most grave and instantaneous risks, those are the ones that we need so-called eco-terrorists to deal with. For those specific harms, deliberation takes too long, legislative change takes too long, negotiating international treaties only for countries to roll back on their obligations also takes too long, and it's time that we can't afford. Not only do those things take too long, though, but they're just unsuitable for very specific problems. Those are all, of course, important mechanisms to deal with other goals of the climate movement and valuable components of the larger climate change puzzle, but they're not catch-all solutions to every single environmental issue. And Sanvi said there are two aims of eco-terrorists. Firstly, publicity, and secondly, crippling businesses, I guess, so that they'll actually start caring about the environment. But I think there's actually a third, much more important and also realistic harm, in the sense that this is what eco-terrorists actually strive towards, which is stopping harms that are immediately going to accrue by direct action, essentially, so damaging the property that is actually going to precipitate environmental harms. So I guess I differ in a sense from my fellow proposition speakers here, because I think there are very specific harms that eco-terrorists deal with. What kind of immediate threats to the environment and humans am I talking about then? Well, empirically, a major object of eco-terrorist inference are oil and gas pipelines. The reason they attack these pipelines in particular is because they frequently spill, and those spills immediately cause devastating harm. So they irreparably damage the internal organs of wildlife, for example. They also cause irreversible reproductive problems in those wildlife, and they cause immediate death in some cases as well. For humans, for us, they also contaminate drinking water with benzene, which is a carcinogenic, it's a cancer-causing substance. Even though that infiltration is immediate, yes it is, even though the infiltration is immediate, that suffering will unfold over years into the future and will kill you slowly from the inside. These spills also just damage the fabric of these local communities as well, though. So the construction of the Marina East 2 pipeline, for example, caused sinkholes, which destroyed the homes in which people maintained their livelihood in Chester and Delaware County. So in cases like these specifically, there is no other recourse that is appropriate other than immediate property damage. The first reason for this is because, just in a second, is because these harms are irreversible, so you need to take immediate action. You can lobby for legislation to be passed to reform slaughterhouses, but in the meantime, those animals will brutally suffer at the hand of exploitation, and untreated wastewater will cause toxic sludge, causing developmental disorders and neurodegenerative diseases. We say on side proposition that as a matter of self-defense, it is entirely justified for you to commit arson on that slaughterhouse to prevent those irreversible harms from precipitating. I'll take your point now.
So, sorry, just to clarify your proposition that your solution to oil spills from construction of gas lines is to blow up the gas lines, is that correct?
Well, they also do things like valve turning. They have lots of other strategies that they can deal with pipelines. They can stop them from working. That's a form of property damage. Anyway, secondly, even if we try to make other mechanisms more efficient, they're still deeply, deeply insufficient and unsatisfactory to deal with the problem that they're trying to address. So bringing a lawsuit, for example, against the manufacturer of that pipeline will take years of time and of money. And even if ExxonMobil ends up settling years later, that money can't reverse things like migraines, the burning lungs, the organ damage that was suffered in the interim by the people of Mayflower after their pipeline spill in Arkansas. Thirdly then, even if there were suitable avenues of change, powerful actors have their fists grasped around them, and this is clear when we notice that these pipelines are often built in areas of indigenous communities and vulnerable groups. I'm running out of time, but there are a couple of other things I want to respond to. The first is that proposition also talk about alienating people from the broader movement, but I actually think this makes the movement stronger. What a lot of people don't know about Ultimate Frisbee is that it's a self-refereed sport. So if a foul is committed, for example, somebody calls it and a productive deliberation process ensues between both sides. But what you can do when that happens is accuse the accuser of an even bigger and worse foul, or you can threaten to blow up the Frisbee arena as well, such that they end up compromising and maybe even dropping their initial accusation. When I do this in the actual game, people accuse me of bad sportsmanship. I respond by saying, actually, what you call poor sportsmanship, I call shifting the Overton window. Which is a great segue into my response to this argument, which is shifting the Overton window. I don't have time to get into it, but Ziad will probably have 5 responses already prepared, so he can deal with that in his speech. I will leave you with this. Many people call me the eco-terrorist of the Frisbee world. I'm so surprised that I got that. So, yeah, many people call me that, maybe because I jump too high, or I dream too big, or I catch too many discs. But I don't let that pervert the importance of what I'm doing, which is pursuing my passion for the game. Similarly, we shouldn't let the label of eco-terrorism pervert the importance of what these individuals and groups are doing. Ultimately, the fight about climate injustice is about a lot of things. As much as it is about combating the rise in global temperatures, it's also about stopping the disasters that are affecting communities today and also those that are being devastated in the near term. So for all of those reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you, Athena. And next, Ziad will argue for the opposition.
A lot of arguments have been made by the proposition team on why we haven't done enough so far, why the things we have tried to do are just never going to be enough. Not a lot of arguments have been made about why eco-terrorism is likely to work, apart from in third proposition, to be fair, and a bit in second proposition about profit motives. So I'm going to posit something very simple, that even if what we haven't done isn't enough, If we engage in more eco-terrorism, we are likely to massively exacerbate the climate crisis and make things worse overall for the movement. 3 reasons then why this hurts the movement writ large. The first is it just obviously increases the amount of backlash that we face. And so, at the point where people perceive terrorism to be scary, even if we do it in peaceful ways that doesn't actually kill people, you still have to drive into buildings. You still have to blow up pipelines. There is still a perception that this is dangerous, that your friend or your coworker or your cousin who might work at this company might have been caught in the crossfire. There's a perception that these actions actively risk the lives of people you care about, and so people are likely to not be willing to engage with the movement to the same extent. They tell you that this is good, that it is important to drive down the profit margin of these corporations, because if you make it difficult enough for them to operate their enterprises, they will disappear or something. I don't know, it's not particularly clear, right? The problem is, as pointed out by First Opposition, the pockets of these companies run deep. And so even if you blow up one building or one data center and push for legislative change and drive down the profit margins a bit, the way they react to this is by lobbying the government to send you to jail more often. They react to this by doing it more, by cutting corners in labor, by cutting corners in other aspects, which ultimately exacerbate the crisis writ large. And so even if you manage to drive down the profit margins to an extent, as Second Proposition points out, it is unclear that you were ever going to do it enough that they're going to say, hey, I'm going to sing Kumbaya and plant trees everywhere, because that's probably not the business model that they operate off of. And the reason why it's important to access the political buy-in that we talk about is because even if in Athena's examples of these oil pipelines, I would like to point out examples of oil pipelines that haven't been built. The one that I was thinking of was the one that went through Canada and America that they ended up cancelling because of protests, which didn't involve eco-terrorism, right? You had people who opted into the green movement, who said this was bad, who lobbied against their politicians to do it, because believe it or not, oil pipelines don't actually spawn overnight. They do actually take a lot of time. There are a lot of planning permissions that are involved. And so the idea that it's incredibly acute and you can't stop it without blowing it up seems fairly short-sighted given how much planning regulations are involved in the vast majority of instances. But even external to that, I think there are a lot more climate policies that affect more people in general, and people have to be willing to vote for these. Things like carbon taxes, which do make it expensive for you to heat your own home, but they are necessary for us to curb the amount of emissions that the West is doing. These are substantially less likely to happen at the point where people are opposed to the green movement writ large. The second really, really obvious harm of engaging in eco-terrorism is the eco-terrorists go to jail. This is not particularly great, because the people who are likely to do eco-terrorism are the people who care the most about the movement. And so the first harm here is that they can't vote in a lot of places. A lot of times, if you engage in terrorism and you go to jail, you lose your ability to vote. But the second is you have less money. You can't work when you're in jail, and when you leave jail, you can't get as good a job. This is incredibly harmful, because if you care about the environment and you have disposable income, you can do things like make more green conscious consumption decisions. You can do things like donate to charitable organizations that help people cope with the harms of environmental damage. You can do things like donate to healthcare to ensure people are able to cope with the harms that happen. But at the point where you are no longer able to do that, I think that's pretty shit. But the third obvious thing is that you are just more likely to have the whole group tarred as a terrorist organization. And this makes it harder for you to engage in general peaceful protests. So Palestine Action is a great example that people brought up, insofar as they did engage in one act of terrorism per se, but it made it substantially harder for people to protest for Palestine in general, because they all get tarred with the same terrorist brush, which makes it substantially more difficult for you to advocate for change in meaningful ways. But the third thing I will point out is that this often results in you accessing bad policies in return. And so I want to be clear here, right? I think oil pipelines are probably not great. The problem is the reason they exist is because people want to get oil from place A to place B. If you stop the pipeline and you blow it up, they're still going to want to get oil from place A to place B. So I ask you, how do they do this on your side of the house? One way they do this is they end up building the oil pipeline through a longer route where people aren't able to engage in eco-terrorism to the same extent. But the other thing they do is they just don't use oil pipelines, like they use freight trains or trucks or whatever, which is substantially worse for the environment, right? Because they are a lot less efficient in how they transport this oil, and so you have more pollution occurring. And so ultimately, even if these policies could hypothetically be good, the way they are frequently implemented and the trade-offs that exist because people still want oil in these places results in less efficient production, more emissions occurring over time. Yes?
Can I just clarify then that you're saying that an oil pipeline is a greener way of doing things?
No, so like, so the problem is, like, yes, no, it's greener than using a truck to drive the same amount of oil from A to B, right? Is it less green than that?
But that's a
Yeah, exactly.
It's a
So,
false dichotomy.
okay, so no, it's not a false dichotomy because the amount of people want oil in place B, there's oil in place A. People want to get this from oil from A to B. I'm not sure how blowing up the pipeline stops them from doing that. This is what has historically happened when oil pipelines haven't been built in certain places. I think they're still probably not great and we should invest in renewables, but I'm not sure how eco-terrorism helps us invest in renewables. Cool. What can you do instead? I think on an individual level, you can obviously just reduce emissions. And I think there's an extent to it just is capped. Like you can't infinitely reduce emissions. Obviously, a lot of other people are engaging in production of this sort of stuff. But you can engage in convincing others. You can engage in the political process. And obviously, this has been imperfect historically. It hasn't worked out as well as we'd want to. But we have pointed out that we have massively increased the amount of production of renewables over time. This is broadly a good thing. And I think we can continue to work in this direction without hampering our ability to engage in change. It's often hard to make these kind of sacrifices though, right? It's hard to go home for Christmas and argue politics with your parents and explain why it's probably better that they vote for the Green Party that supports carbon taxes than the party that promises to lower the cost of oil going forward. It's hard to try and convince people that, carbon taxes are broadly a positive thing and that instead of heating your home as much as possible to make sure you're cozy, you should layer up sometimes. Oftentimes it's incredibly difficult to make these sacrifices and it's more difficult to convince the people around us to make these sacrifices. But it's easy for us to blame corporations, to play semantics, to say we support eco-terrorism from the comfort of our own homes, without directly engaging this sort of stuff ourselves, without risking our own lives and saying that I'm going to be willing to go to jail for this sort of stuff. It's hard for us to reflect, to be honest, and to ask ourselves what we can actually do and what we can actually impact the world in terms of trying to reduce emissions going forward. Oppose.
Thank you very much. And now the final speaker for the proposition, Jade.
I hope my computer doesn't die on me. But anyways. When every legal channel has been put to the test and failed to stop the destruction of our only home, what is left to do in the face of an ever-growing climate crisis? My fellow speakers have already presented their definitions of what eco-terrorism is, as simply being acts of violence and sabotage against organizations that are perceived as threats to the environment. Though it is the fact that there is even a kind of eco-terrorism to begin with that demonstrates that there is a life-threatening issue at hand that has continued to go unchecked. Therefore, given the catastrophic failures of governments and corporations to address environmental collapse, eco-terrorism becomes a morally and strategically necessary escalation to enact meaningful environmental change. I first want to start by explaining why there is a need for eco-terrorism, even if there have already been some environmental efforts to slow down the effects of climate change. It's really simple. To slow the ineffective action from institutions make passive activism inadequate. As mentioned by previous speakers, current unchecked carbon emissions have caused the Earth's temperature to rise by nearly 2 degrees. However, further research suggested it's actually possible that the Earth's temperature can raise to 3 degrees by 2050. But what does this mean? We have already heard this before. Increases in droughts, wildfires, monsoons, harsher air pollution, you name it. Though this means that left unchecked, increased carbon emissions would only result in a harsher degradation of the world's natural resources to build new structures to support displaced individuals at the hands of a climate crisis, essentially turning the world in a spin-off of the WALL-E movie, for lack of a better term. But again, this is something that has already been mentioned, not only in the room tonight, but across virtually our whole lives. And despite the peaceful efforts that have been done in attempts of policy making like the Green New Deal or even peaceful protests, how can we genuinely say that these have been effective measures if they have not fully managed to pass in terms of legislature, but also carbon emissions from industrial plants only go up every year? This leaves space for something like eco-terrorism to compensate for the institutional paralysis that has plagued modern policymaking. However, it must be noted that eco-terrorism is not a new thing. It has found its roots in radical environmentalism of the 1960s under the belief that human society, left unchecked, will lead to total ecological degradation. We are still fighting against the same problems for some 60-odd years. If this has been a battle fought over half a century, then how can terrorism be morally justified as a legal practice to expedite the fight that seems endless? Craig Rosenbraugh, a spokesman of the Earth Liberation Front, presents an argument for the choice of evils, which questions whether it is a greater evil to destroy property of large corporations or choose to allow these corporations to destroy the environment. This creates a moral clarification. With property destruction, in the name of saving the biosphere, is framed as a necessary lesser evil. Though there must be a distinction between what this leading definition of terrorism is versus what eco-terrorism aims to do. Many eco-terrorists emphasize that terrorism, as we think of it, targets primarily civilians, while eco-terrorism historically does not. Eco-terrorism is directed towards property and institution rather than innocent lives, even if they may get caught in the crossfire. However, this leads to further distinction between eco-terrorism and eco-sabotage, which directly states under its moral principles, which also is done by eco-terrorism, to put that out there, that under no circumstances can human lives be destroyed for the sake of environmental property and destruction. But we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, there's been a lot said about the justification for eco-terrorism, but what are some cases of this philosophy in practice? One notable instance is the 1998 Valley Ski Resort arson enacted by the Earth Liberation Front. It opposed the destruction of endangered lynx habitats and deforestation, causing anywhere between $12 to $26 million in damage, and sparked nationwide media coverage for this environmental issue. Though instances like this may be something done for media coverage, which has been argued on multiple platforms tonight, that this is more of a nuisance, though it still highlights a core question. What makes the destruction of a mountain for profit more legitimate than destroying the infrastructure that harms the vital habitats in said mountain?
On that point?
Nah. Moving away from the US, there is also an example of the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, which is too long of a name. Anyways, which in the early 2000s directed efforts against harsh oil production in the Niger Delta. This exposed the oppression of the local peoples and the harsh degradation of natural environments at the hand of corporations in partnership with the government, using a combination of guerrilla warfare and sabotage of oil infrastructures to complete their goals. Ultimately, they've continued their efforts for years. Though their actions resulted in a reduced oil production by 33% and drove out certain foreign investments of their oil industry, there is still the ever-present issue of omnipresent land degradation and minimal land development in the region, which has gone overlooked, though this is still an issue that is fought by the movement, albeit in a fractured state. Despite these cases of somewhat modern instances of climate resistance, there is still something to be said about the stark decrease in the amount of eco-terrorist acts since 2010. There are few reliable documented cases of eco-terrorism in the past 20 years, but this is not to say that it is unsuccessful, rather that it has not been mass implemented, meaning that the potential impact remains unrealized. We are only at the tip of the bombable iceberg. The world can lead demonstrations against new destructive commercial developments, lobby against environmentally unfriendly legislation, etc. But this will never be enough. Now we have to move towards the underbelly of that iceberg, beginning with a more palatable form of civil disobedience, but it is important to take that final leap of faith if true change wants to take form. In summary, nonviolent activism cannot stop the building of pipelines, mining, or animal testing alone. Eco-terrorism directly targets the for-profit incentive of driving ecological collapse. When peaceful methods fail, they continue to do so. Escalation becomes morally required. This is a case that can be found across all of history. The violent actions of revolutions across the world expedite change for the better. So, what makes environmental revolution much different? Because at the end of the day, property regenerates, ecosystems don't.
Thank you, Jade. And now to sum up for the opposition, our final speaker, Evan.
There's been great discussion tonight on both sides, and I just want to open by saying that I understand the frustrations of the proposition on this topic. I am engaged with this. We are all engaged with this, and there is no doubt that climate change is the issue of our generation. But I cannot, with good conscience, advocate or call myself an eco-terrorist. This is because violence is not the correct answer to this solution. The proposition has fundamentally failed to show why eco-terrorism is the right answer to this situation, and I would love to propose to you all an alternative. Now, I'm a law student. I like things fitting into nice, neat boxes, so I'm going to give you 3 points. The first is a conceptual one. Violence is totalitarian. It overwhelms rhetoric. It engages it in a way that cannot be put back to where it is. When you advocate for terrorism, you are advocating for a form of violence. Even if that violence is justified, it opens wounds, and it leaves a legacy that will stand long after the issue it was meant to solve has passed. Ireland is not a country that has not known violence. That is a terrible sentence. Ireland is a country that has known violence. We know, in our hearts, we know the legacy that violence takes out in communities. It is not positive. Issues that affect our past still divide us today. How are we supposed to come together to fix such an overwhelming, multifaceted issue like climate change if we cannot unify ourselves? But more than conceptual, eco-terrorism just isn't practical. Violence alienates support. We have seen this time and time again. Movements that are gaining traction are alienated when small members of this community, sure.
Eco-terrorist attacks actually are very, very low in numbers. So given this, why can't people just opt into other parts of the movement, more moderate parts of the movement, when eco-terrorist attacks happen?
Well, I'm not advocating for anything to do with the moderate parts of the movement. I would love if people opted into the moderate parts of the movement. I just don't think there should be any eco-terrorism. This isn't something that you can have both ways. You can't advocate for a moderate engagement and trying to change this way and then also blow up the pipelines when you don't get your way. Violence will always alienate support. And following on this, I would advocate for forms of civil disobedience. But you can be civilly disobedient without being violent, without being terrorist. Now, Jade has proposed that loss of life is never a worthwhile trade, but I do want to point out that eco-terrorism causes tangible harm onto communities. Because the environment is a resource that can be exchanged. Oftentimes, pipelines and environmental damaging projects bring genuine positive economic growth to communities. Eco-terrorism may be depriving the companies of their profit incentive, but they are also depriving the local communities of their jobs, of their livelihoods. This is a real, genuine harm that is being put onto people that the proposition has failed to engage with. Now, I'm not advocating for civil disobedience in a petty way. Movements like Just Stop Oil, throwing paint on famous paintings, it's pointless because it is targeting victims of the system. Nobody wants to get stuck in traffic on their way to work because climate activists have decided that they've chosen this particular motorway to lie down on, and unfortunately that means that the NHS worker can't go and do their 12-hour shift. I'm very sorry, but that's not going to work, but that is not our only method of engaging with civil disobedience. And in fact, we have seen that people who have garnered the greatest support are not those who advocate for terrorism. They are people like Greta Thunberg, who acknowledge that when you try and unify and engage with the system, you can achieve change. Because at the end of the day, despite what the proposition has advocated for, climate change's reputation can get worse. It can absolutely get worse. It can be so much worse than it is now. It is fundamentally important that if we are going to engage with movements, that we bring as many people onto our side as we can. And eco-terrorism will continue to alienate the communities that it affects, as well as ostracize those who do not care for the unfortunate side effects, such as the innocent people who may get caught in the crossfire. Now, I've talked about the conceptual, I've talked about the practical issues with eco-terrorism, but I want to talk about the moral issues that I have with it for a second. Because terrorism fundamentally is about fear. It uses fear. And fear is not in and of itself bad. It is a tool. But when you engage with any form of terrorism, no matter what cause you are advocating for, you are trying to use that tool of fear to achieve your goal. And in that, you are perpetuating the same cycles. I am desperate for our governments and the people who are in charge of the world to take action against climate change. I am terrified. I am terrified that they will not do it in time or that they will not do enough. And I know that most of the people in this room are too. But when you try to channel that fear into a tool and trying to use it as a shortcut to fail to engage with the actual systems, all you are doing is perpetuating cycles of violence and trying to justify it because this is the good kind. Real change is not brought about with fear. It is brought about with hope. And I am asking everyone in this room, eco-terrorism seems appealing. We all want answers. But to bring about genuine, proper change on a global scale, we have to hope that it is possible, as unlikely as that feels, because it is possible. The amount of change that we have seen in so many of our social, community, different aspects in the last 50 years has been as outstanding. There are people who could not live 100 years ago who are now recognized as equals among us, and that is fantastic, but we need to continue that social change. We need to meet this fear, not with more fear or with violence, but with hope. Now, the proposition has failed to show why eco-terrorism can bring about that change, and I am asking you all to consider the alternative, to engage with our systems, to work and to genuinely be passionate about the political and social movements, and to put all of your energy into that, because it is possible. And we can hope for a better world. Thank you.
So thank you to the speaker and to all our speakers for what has been a really excellent debate tonight. I will now put the question to the House. When I call on you to vote, please vote by shouting aye or shouting nay. And in a very carefully, scientifically measured process, the loudest side will win. So on the motion that this House supports eco-terrorism, all those in favour say aye. Aye! All those against say nay. Nay! I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Madam Auditor, ladies and gentlemen, as the Auditor introduced me earlier, I'm in charge of the political coverage in the Irish Times, and in the absence of anyone more distinguished or even moderately well known, I've been invited here tonight, and it is a pleasure and it is an honour to be here, especially as a UCD graduate and former member of the L&H. I'd have been very disappointed had you not. In UCD, back in the 1990s, we regarded Trinity students as effete metropolitans, probably Protestants, definitely West British, more likely to sup sherry than to guzzle pints in the time-honoured tradition of our Gaelic ancestors. Trinity students, in turn, regarded us as agricultural ignoramuses, unkempt muckers, rolling up to Belfield in tractors or Ford Cortinas, possibly related by incestuous marriage to the two Johnnies, and generally unacquainted with the ways of the civilised world. If Trinity was proud of Wolf Tone, we were closer to the Wolf Tones. So it's great to be back in the belly of the beast, to see my old friends around the walls. I don't know if the tradition endures, but on a couple of occasions when I came here to speak for UCD, there was a few gentlemen up there, and I think they had been at the sherry, but they would dangle a hangman's noose from the balcony. Though in fairness to them, few UCD students were actually executed. It was a really good debate tonight, I thought, and it illustrated the fact that there are no easy answers to these questions. But I think our speakers went a long way towards informing us about the questions. Laughlin's deep research on the topic, despite being an arts student, hit on an important phenomenon: the rise of the performative climate activist. I suppose terrorism is a form of performance art. He argued that playing fair is not working, and insisted that eco-terrorism is the only way. Sanvi thought eco-terrorism is not a moral high ground on which she wanted to dwell. She put her finger on something very important in the whole debate. She said that people have more pressing issues than the climate. And she focused on what I think is a central issue in this debate: the question of whether eco-terrorism is effective even on its own terms. Jessica questioned our whole definition of terrorism. I learned a lot from her speech. She talked about how climate activists had watered down their message to get a place at the table, but once at the table, she said they were ignored. Now she says, or she fears, I think, that the climate movement is defanged, I think was the word you used, and powerless. John insisted that the real eco-terrorists were the companies and governments who are promoting the destruction of habitats, the burning of fossil fuels, and who are exacerbating climate change. Athena has given up working in McDonald's, we learned, and taken up ultimate frisbee, which I think we can all agree is progress in her life. Though possibly there's some way to go, yes. She made a really strong case, though, that it takes too long to go through conventional political routes for climate actions. And again, this is a question that is really central to this debate. Ziad argued that acts of eco-terrorism would always be effective because of their isolated nature. And the only thing that works is mass protest and political action. He asserted, I think we can say without fear of contradiction, that going to jail is not particularly good, and is pretty shit.
Amen.
Hard to argue with that one. Jade argued that eco-terrorism is morally and strategically necessary, and asked what is worse, the destruction of a ski resort or the destruction of a habitat to make way for a ski resort. Evan summed up with a simple but compelling argument, saying that violence is not the solution. It is wrong, he said, but it is also counterproductive, and he advocated civil disobedience. I was thinking about eco-terrorism this afternoon before I came here, and I found myself quite skeptical about its methods, but sympathetic to the motivation. One thing did trouble me reading about acts of eco-terrorism, or what is called eco-terrorism, is that many of the protagonists of such actions said that they wished to raise awareness of the climate crisis. I'm always slightly allergic to efforts to raise my awareness about anything, because invariably I'm aware of it already. I also shudder when people say that we need to talk about whatever it is. We need to talk about erectile dysfunction, or we need to talk about the male menopause. So let's see where I'm going with this. It's my stage in life. I often think that's the last thing we need to talk about. But maybe we do need to talk about eco-terrorism. Do they really raise awareness of climate change amongst people who are not previously aware of it? Or are they more likely to annoy people and turn them off the message of climate activists? Perhaps the problem is not that people are unaware of climate change, but that they don't feel the need to do anything about it. Eco-terrorists want dramatic action. They want to see the immediate end of fossil fuel use. I understand that, but they have to ask, how many people should go cold? How much should economies contract? Because when economies contract, who do you think feels it most? When the public finances are squeezed, and we have direct memories of this in this country in the not too distant past, when the public finances are squeezed, the people who feel the squeeze most are those who depend on the state the most. So these are complicated questions. They involve trade-off and compromises. And is the way of addressing questions like this, of answering these admittedly very serious but very complex questions, to throw soup at a painting? And yet, what are we supposed to do? Climate action is in retreat everywhere. Trump wants to drill, baby, drill. The EU is watering down targets. In Ireland, I cover politics for a living down the road in Leinster House, and you can feel the priority draining away from climate action in this country. Why is that? It's because the Greens are not in government anymore. Why are the Greens not in government anymore? Because we didn't vote for them in sufficient numbers. And this, I'm afraid, is the hard truth about how hard climate action is. Ultimately, you've got to win the argument. You've got to win a mandate. You've got to win elections. I'm not just an observer of politics and democracy. I'm a Democrat, and I believe in democratic decision-making, and through democracy and through politics, I believe, is the way of achieving change. Much of this, I'm afraid, will come down to your generation to fix. Let me give you 3 recommendations. Realism, ambition, and insofar as you can manage it, a bit of patience. Thank you very much for the invitation.